Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, because we know people are joining from different parts of the world. My name is Pradeep Nayak. I am going to host this webinar, and I am representing here the Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership, which is located at the University of Waterloo in Canada. So I would start with a few rounds of introductions before we invite our speaker today to speak and make the presentation. So just first, as a introduction to the network itself, the Vulnerability to Viability, or the B2V Global Partnership, is a transdisciplinary research, knowledge, and action network with over 100 members from Africa, Asia, Canada, and internationally. Currently, we have close to 150 people and institutions that are participating as members in this network. The goal of the global partnership is to support small-scale fisheries and coastal communities in their transition from vulnerability to viability. And the way we understand these transitions from vulnerability to viability is not just in an economic sense, but also to represent the political, the cultural, environmental, ecological aspects of human life, especially in the small-scale fisheries communities. So it is more comprehensive and holistic in how we understand vulnerability and viability. Our focus at the network is, manifold. So we engage in co-creating and co-producing knowledge that is effective for, facilitating these transitions. We also work on creating a repository in the form of an information system for the V2V. Also using that information or data to develop multifaceted capacity right from the fishing community level to government policymakers to early career researchers and civil society, and also engage in synthesis and integration of the knowledge so that governance and policy can be informed through knowledge mobilization. The B2B Global Partnership aims to identify the diverse factors and conditions contributing to the vulnerability of small-scale fisheries and engage in collaborative efforts with small-scale fisher communities and other NGO, government, and university partners to enhance SSF, or small-scale fisheries viability. So this is an all-round effort, to build viability within the small-scale fisheries. We are conducting transdisciplinary, community-engaged research in 6 countries of Africa. That includes Ghana, Malawi, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, and Tanzania, and 6 countries in Asia, which includes Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, and Thailand. And there are many other countries that are also involved in this research process. In doing so, the V2V Global Partnership brings people and organizations together across political, cultural, and disciplinary boundaries through a shared interest in addressing global change impacts on small-scale fisheries. The B2B thematic webinar, for which we have gathered virtually here today, this series is an initiative of the B2B Global Partnership to facilitate and generate high-level discussions on vulnerability and viability themes and topics within the context of small-scale fisheries and coastal communities and inland fisheries as well. The goal is to facilitate and feature academics, government representatives, practitioners, and members of the civil society who have made significant contributions to the theoretical, practical, and policy aspects of small-scale fisheries, both locally, regionally, and globally. The B2B thematic webinar series takes place on the last Friday of every month, which is today, and it will continue to be so during the year 2024 in December, but also continue in 2025. So you are all invited to join us on the last Friday every month. The series is available internationally through live streaming on YouTube. Details regarding the monthly webinar, including the speakers, topics, and titles, and links to the webinar platform, is available on our website, which is www.v2bglobalpartnership.org. Today's webinar is the 11th in the series of V2B thematic webinars planned for the year 2024. and the 47th since January 2021 when it all started. And it is my privilege today to introduce Dr. Vipul Singh as our distinguished speaker today. Dr. Vipul Singh is a professor of history in the Department of History at the University of Delhi. He specializes in environmental history, but he is very well known for his groundbreaking work on the history of rivers in India and elsewhere, to the extent that he is really, really well known as a river historian, in addition to being an environmental historian. He received his doctoral degree from the Delhi University, continued with a post-doctorate from the Ludwig Maximilian University, Munich, Germany, and he has over 25 years of teaching and research experience at the Delhi University itself. He is an alumnus, Carson Fellow of the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society, Munich and Germany. As a historian, Dr. Singh is a prolific writer. He has written several books and peer-reviewed articles. Some of the key books that he have written includes the artisans in 18th century Eastern India, History of Survival, the Human Footprint on Environment Issues in India by Macmillan, which addresses one of the most pressing issues of contemporary India and the world, the ways in which human beings and their actions have historically changed and continue to change the face of the globe. His most recent monograph is titled Speaking Rivers, Environmental History of Mid-Ganga Flood Country, 1540 to 1885. And those dates are very obvious because Dr. Singh is a historian. It includes the Speaking River book includes a long-term environmental study of mid-Ganga flood country and includes also the discussion on inland fisheries, and some of which you will hear from Dr. Singh today. He has also contributed to books on commons. Unfortunately, I had the opportunity to work with him as the editor of a book on commonization and decommonization, where he wrote about the governing fluvial commons in colonial Bihar in India, alluvion and the diluvian regulation and decommonization. Dr. Singh has not only written several articles and books, but has been actively involved in secondary and senior secondary level curriculum development and planning for school students. Most of his publications have been on developing life skills among children as well as with the study of history. The Government of India's Central Board of Secondary Education has appointed him as a convener of a newly developed course on Indian knowledge and tradition. This is really important work in terms of curriculum development and contributing to the education of young students. He's currently working on a book project on the effects of global climate anomalies during the Mughal rule. Dr. Singh is on the editorial board of Water History Journal, published by Springer. He is a life member of Asian Association for Environmental History, AAEH. It is my honor today to invite Dr. Vipul Singh to deliver today's talk for the B2B Global Partnership Thematic Webinar Series 2024, November. And the title of his talk is going to be Historical Dimensions of Inland Fisheries in Bihar, Model for Riverine Waterscapes. Thank you very much, Dr. Singh, for making the time. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Prateep. Such a wonderful introduction of V2V and my grand introduction. So, good morning, first of all, to all the scholars and researchers from Canada and Britain, Southeast Asia. Very good afternoon. And of course, Maha, who's been organizing so beautifully the Zoom webinar. Then Farosat, I think Maha is absent, so she's busy somewhere. So Farosat has been doing this. Good morning to and my then greetings to all V2V global partners and members, and also to all other audience and scholars who have joined from India on YouTube and from many other countries, I guess. Now, I'm really very thankful to V2V, especially Prateep, for inviting me to discuss my research on this platform, which apparently has a very huge viewership. And, when Prateep sent me a mail about this, inviting me to speak on this platform, because, as you know, V2V is about vulnerability to viability. So fishing community is one community which has been historically, as a historian, I can see that how the fishing community has been vulnerable in various forms. So that's why we decided on a topic which is the title of my talk today, the historical dimension of the inland fisheries in Bihar and the model for riverine waterscapes. Let me share my screen, the PowerPoint that I have. Is it visible? Yeah. So, let us begin with something like, we are imagining of
Can you make it full
fishermen
screen?
in the 18th century. Huh?
Can you make it full screen?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Play. Yeah. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. So let's imagine that we have a fisherman in the 18th century, and the fisherman is from Bihar, and Bihar, as you know, is located in the middle Ganga basin, and the fisherman is casting his net in a village pond, who is very confident in his community's shared right to water, right? So I'm just we are imagining an 18th century situation, and we just fast forward a few decades, and then that same pond is leased out to zamindars or the wealthy landowners, forcing the fishermen to work as laborers on what was sometimes a kind of a communal property, what we call as a common property resource. Now, this transformation, and it is actually emblematic of a kind of a colonial policies in the entire, this Gangetic Bihar and Bengal also. And this continued even after independent India, when India got independence in 1947, and there was end of the colonial rule, the same situation almost continues. So despite the abundance of water resources that this region has, because Bihar is actually situated along the Ganga river basin, and you have the Ganga flows right in the middle of the I can show you in the next slide. So this is Ganga, which flows right at the center of Bihar. So virtually what we actually see is that the middle Ganga basin is identified more or less with the state. And, in fact, if you look at this map here, there are many rivers. I mean, the second map, that's the adjacent map that you see, there are many smaller river streams also. So this state is full of rivers all around. And then what it has is that it also has many, floodplain wetlands. You have many oxbow lakes, meanders, you have many seasonal floodplains and reservoirs, ponds, what we could call as pokers in that state. Then you have many tanks all around. So, I mean, despite this kind of an abundance of water resource, what we see is that there has been traditionally a problem for the fishing community. The fishers have remained vulnerable in this state. I mean, this despite the fact that it is so water rich, as a state. So, despite the abundance of water resource, the fisher community in the state it remains kind of vulnerable due to the inadequate access and control. And the larger or the large water bodies that we find, and also this state is also featured with another very interesting geographical characteristic that is called the Diara land, which is in Bengal also known as Chor. So Diara land is another very interesting phenomenon of this the entire state, which along with these different water bodies that I just talked about, they historically all these water bodies, including the Diara land and the river fronts of the Diara land, they have been monopolized by wealthy landholders. And they were, most of the time, the water bodies were leased to the highest bidders. And in that, when it was leased out, it so happened that all the fishers were then sidelined from any kind of, direct ownership from these water bodies. So instead of that, what we see is that they were relegated to kind of a daily wage laborers. They were stripped off from all kind of autonomy. There were no, economic benefits. And, there was kind of a marginalization of the entire fishing community, which is so very large in this area. So today, I will actually discuss how these historical processes shape the governance of fisheries and propose kind of a common-based management model to restore the kind of equity and then also the sustainability in these the different water bodies that we find in Bihar. So few of the questions that key questions that I have tried to explore, which you will see in my talk today, is that all these my thrust actually revolves around the question of management of the inland fisheries. And I have taken the case of this Middle Ganga region, which is today, as I said, largely identified with Bihar. So I'm not saying that, in other states it is, I mean, this similar phenomena could be observed also in Bengal. One of my PhD students who just, last year finished his PhD, Dr. Sonu, he has done a very interesting work on Bengal. And he has also explained how there has been, these fishing communities have been vulnerable and how they have been exploited. So, there are similar conditions in Bihar also. Bihar also has large water bodies, but what is different that we find in Bihar is that apart from those chore lands, we also have, huge oxbow lakes, what we call as munds. So in these munds are, which is locally in particularly in East Champaran and West Champaran region, it is known as munds. These are huge lakes, and these are oxbow lakes, and they are they are actually linked to the various rivers. So I begin with the question that how the colonial states' fiscal motives fisheries. And this would, of course, be in contrast to the the traditional fishing rights that were in place for centuries, and uh, and this then takes us to the other related questions, like what were the socio-cultural impacts of this state control management on the on the fishers communities, and because they had deep connections to the aquatic resources, and they were actually, that was one of the prime basis of their livelihood. So using the archival sources of the British period, the British colonial rule, and and of course, which are all related to inland fisheries, and many of the court cases that we find from the archives, I have tried to analyze the evolution of the acts related to the inland fisheries. And we see that in many of the judgments, there was a gradual shift in the colonial judiciary's stand from early ruling that supported public fishing rights to kind of a later and we see in that later decisions are favoring the private claims of the zamindars. So the judgments are actually the court judgments, they are aligned with government revenue goals, and that makes it much more interesting. So what these all these judgments, I mean, when these judgments are favoring those zamindars, the landlords, sometimes the states, these are at the expense of the fishers community. So the livelihood of the fishers community remained pathetic, and they were relegated to the working as daily wages. So what is the bottom line? So the bottom line is that, can we make the lives of the vulnerable fisher community viable? So when we study these historical accounts, can we actually make the lives of the the fishers viable, as this V2V objective suggests? And this question actually challenges us to rethink in some way that whether these leasing out systems and whether these are actually okay, or whether remaining within the leasing out system, we can explore some kind of sustainable models that ensures kind of, say, equitable access to the resources and improve the livelihood of the fishers. And then we can also then empower the fishers. So by addressing these historical inequalities and introducing these such kind of models, and trying to understand these models, models which is associated with or models which are based on community, we can actually create opportunities that offer some kind of long-term economic stability, and also the dignity of the fishers community. So the proposed common-based management model, which I think which is the thrust of my paper, it actually builds on some historical insights that we get from the very heavily rich water resource state of Bihar. So this model basically advocates for a community-led management, and it actually then gives you the legal, gives the fishers community legal protection for, access to the water bodies, that huge water bodies that is available in the state. And this model then prioritizes the kind of an ecological sustainability, right? And so the idea is that, through these historical case studies, that is, having lessons from the past, we can actually enrich the contemporary discussion on the governance of the inland fisheries. Now we have accounts of many medieval and early modern states making efforts to dig canals. We have various references in chronicles, accounts coming just before the colonial rule, that tanks, ponds, wells, where they were all, used by the communities, local communities, and the state had no role to play in that. So these were kind of common property resource, and the control over water or any resource from water bodies, such as even the inland fisheries, they were, I mean, rarely intended to be. There were, the state never bothered about taking any or making any income from these resources. So the state actually did not assign much importance to revenue from the fishing business at all. And therefore, one of the reasons was that the fishing was not a business, much of a business at that time. It was scattered, and therefore it, it was imperceptible in some sense. Now, traditionally, what we see is that water was treated as an open access resource with no property right, and it was a common property resource. Even the early years of British colonial rule in the 18th century, water, and even including the inland fisheries, they were considered as common property resource. So when the British got the Diwani right in 1765, that is around the middle of the 18th century, I mean, these traditional rights remained to the common people, and also to the the fishing rights remained with the common fishermen. So if we read the various acts introduced by the British in the 19th century, we will see that we can figure out that the traditional system that were in place are actually then moving towards kind of what we call as, which Prateep has very in various other cases has given emphasis on the idea of decommunization. So in fact, if you read the 19th century the archival sources, they actually give us a reference of the earlier conditions, right? So they actually tell us that there was a traditional system in place. For example, acts like North Indian Canal and Drainage Act or the Bengal Irrigation Act, they reflect this kind of an understanding. So, in most of these, because when the certain acts were being written, there was a background always given to this act in the process of making those acts. So the different acts that we find, this gives us a reflection of this kind of a traditional rights to the common people. But among all these laws that were then introduced in the 19th century, it was noticeable that the state ownership was being emphasized. And in fact, so what we see is that as the colonial state became more and more powerful, gradually what we see is that the rights over water was gradually decommunized, right? So 20th century actually witnessed an almost dramatic kind of an interest and intent of the state to assert the rights over water. So it was completely taken away. All water bodies were then started getting leased out. Now, Bihar Private Irrigation Act is, it talks about the rights of the irrigated water. And it actually tells us about the the change circumstances, talks about the elimination of the local self-governance that was in place earlier. I mean, there are many acts. I mean, all the acts that that we read, it actually tells us that how the rights of the common people were taken away. But then, why these rights were being taken? I mean, especially when it comes to the question of the fishermen, because I mean, there were many acts, regulations that were being passed. Alluvium diluvium regulation of 1825, the embankment regulation, the Canal Act, Bengal Embankment Act, the Bengal Private Protection Fishery Act, Inland Fishery Act. These were all gradually eliminating the rights of the common people. So many of them were affecting the rights of common people at large. And then the Bengal Private Protection Fisheries Act and Inland Fisheries Act has taken away the rights from the fishers. So what we see is that, why these changes are taking place. And as you know, that the fishers who are, I mean, they used to fish in the surrounding ponds, the pokers, the lakes, the oxbow lakes, what we call as bunds. So they use these lakes, the water bodies, which were close to the, rivers or the Diara lands. They were used by the fisher community, and most of these Diara land were inhabited by the fisher communities. But then, the question comes that why the British were so, what happened that the British started believing that, even the water bodies can be used for revenue generation. Now, the British had brought with them many European concepts, and that included the modern acts of taxing the inland fisheries also. So the government actually redefined many long existing traditional rights of the communities. And unlike the medieval rulers, what we see is that the colonial administration then looked at the rivers and the water bodies. And the status of fisheries changed drastically because the government could now foresee the prospect of the income coming from the fisheries. So in the 18th and early 19th century, the access to water was important for their control over trade. And then the British had taken, because as we know, in 1858, the British had taken full control of the East India Company as government of India. So British Crown was properly the ruler of India. And then the British government began to invest massively on various schemes like canal construction and embankments of the rivers, because they believed that, these or many of the embankments were strengthened because they believed that, the flood that comes in the rivers actually destroys many of the cultivable field, and then that affects the revenue collection of the British government. Now, all these things were introduced just with the one motive, that is increasing the revenue of this British. Now, the earlier laws with limited direct implication on the various local communities. Obviously, I mean, when the British came, they were not intending to bring these water bodies into their regulation for revenue generation. And one of the first attempt that was made was in 1819 with the Bengal regulation. And this was the beginning of the kind of fresh attempt to codify a European law and regulate the movement of the rivers. Then we had many acts that were passed, like, you had the Fisheries Act, the Charter Act. And so all these acts came gradually. And in one way or the other, they were all, attempts by the government to increase the revenues. So what we see in the 19th century is that the control and access to water was taken away from the people and also from the fishers community. So we have various acts like the Canal Act. I just you can see on the screen. And then you also have the embankment regulation, the Bengal Embankment Act. These are all acts which were introduced to regulate the water bodies. And canal regulation is also one aspect which is very important, that was done for the navigation purpose. And then the taxes were levied on the users of the canals, because these canals were also then used for irrigating the fields. So those who use those canals, they had to pay taxes. Now, other than providing irrigation facility and protecting people from flood, there were other, dynamics to the construction of canals and embankments. We are not, going into details of those, but these were all part of this larger project of the British government to enhance the revenue of the states. Now, the implication of all these acts that we see, the implications were very grave, and the benefits of the fishers in particular got diminished in the long run. So the rivers, when it is embanked, when it is canalized, that means you are actually what you're doing is that you're not allowing water to flow freely. Then the fishers community are not supposed to use those water bodies like the canals for the fishing purposes. And very interestingly, one of the early 20th century engineer, William Wilcock, has suggested that how the colonial engineers were possibly mistaken by the success of the flood control projects. That worked. I have written this at another place in one of my articles that I wrote for the Commonization edited book. So in that sense, the understanding that came along with the British, because they had a understanding of water bodies which was European based, and possibly when they introduced these regulations in this part of Middle-Ganga basin, they were implementing it to just for revenue generation, but then they were faced also by many challenges. So there were improvisations done later on. And we can see that in the case of, the two acts that were related to the fishers, the Bengal Private Protection Fisheries Act of 1889 and the Inland Fisheries Act of 1897. Now, one of the important area apart from the various river bodies is the Dera land, and it is a kind of a river island, which is very common in the Middle Ganga basin. And basin, it is known as, did not impose any tax on the fishers, the fishing community who were living in the Dera. And most of the fishermen, these Mallas, they would live in these Dera land. land which is a kind of a temporary land. And these Dara land was half the year underwater. So, it could be cultivated only with some winter crops. So most of the time what we see is that even today, that in these Dara lands, most of the inhabitants of these Dara land, traditionally, they belong to the Mallas or the fishers. They lived in those vulnerable lands. Now, because of the frequent, it is because of the frequent process of the creation and then dissolution of the lands, because every year there is a flood in the Ganga and many various other rivers that we find in this area. So these frequent processes actually lead to the cutting away of much of the land and then new land coming up in some other area, right? So it's a kind of a very vulnerable, it's not a kind of a permanent landscape that you hear of. And so they had to move. These Malla communities, the people living in these Dara land had to move frequently when there was flood water. And the vulnerability and the temporality, temporary character of the Dara landscape did not allow any kind of a permanence in cultivation. So, the main livelihood in that sense for this community was the river fishes. And they used to, these Malla community would catch fish from the surrounding river, and then that was sold in the mainland markets. Now, the mid-Ganga basin is, as you know, home to many rivers, and I've been emphasizing this. And Dara is actually part of this, the process of the huge floodplains that we find in this part. Now, the formation of the new islands is one part of its, because a large, these Dara lands are huge Dara lands sometimes, and then you have water bodies around these Dara lands, and then you also have fishes available in those Dara lands. Now, gradually, what we see is that traditionally these fishermen who were living in these Dara land, they would catch fishes in those water bodies. Nobody is bothered about owning it. But gradually what we see is that in the 19th century, even these Dara lands have been been claimed to be owned by the local zamindars. And it is very interesting, the changes that we see under the British rule is, it's not that the British were in the earlier stage trying to include Dara into their revenue generation machine. But then what happened that after after the grant of Diwani to the British East India Company, they tried to redefine the traditional rights through the modern acts. And then the company introduced the water tax, what was known as the Jalkar, which is in fact even today, Jalkar is one of the important terms that is used in many of the acts that were passed in this part of the state. So we'll see that later in our talk. So Jalkar, the company actually introduced water taxes in the lakes, ponds, and many of the water bodies. And over the 19th century, what we see is that the Jalkars came in possession of the various leaseholders, the Izaradars. And then they were able to charge the fishermen for the access of the fisheries. So basically what we see is that these Izaradars, who are the leaseholders, they were basically the revenue farmers, and the East India Company's government was through these, leasing out these water bodies was actually taking out revenue from this land. And then in turn, they were given to the Mala communities, subleased sometimes, or they were hired to catch fishes. So what we see is that in the 19th century there has been a transformation of even the Dera landscape, and it so happened that once the British government started realizing that even these unsettled Dera land was a loss of revenue to the state, the British East India Company sought to settle all disputes, because they were always, these lands, Dera lands, were very disputable ones, because suddenly after every flood, a new landscape would come up, and various zamindars would claim rights over those landscapes. Sometimes the fisher community would also claim right over it. So then the government tried to regulate this kind of a temporary character of the landscape of the Dara. And then they introduced what we call as the Regulation 11, which is Bengal Alluvium and Diluvium Regulation. This was passed in 1825. And it's kind of a tangible legislation. Now, traditionally what we see is that when after Diwani right was given to the the zamindars were supposed to pay portion of their revenue to the British East India Company. When they realized that despite the flood, despite the drought, because this is also an area which was prone to droughts every 4-5 years, and then followed by the drought, there will be a flood coming in. So there were possibly, after every 4-5 years, there were possibly 1 year without any crop cultivation in the area. So the zamindars, what they would do is that because the zamindars were not given relief from the British East India Company about revenue, despite the flood, despite the droughts. So what they would do, that they tried to include even the Dera land within their, revenue production, and because they had to give something to the British government. So it all started with that, and then the British government realized that, okay, the zamindars are now taking revenue from those Dera lands also. So then the government came with this Dera Regulation Act, which is known as famously as the Alluvium and Diluvium Regulation. Now, then there are interesting cases about the regulation of the fisheries, and what we see is that the Bengal, one of the first acts which was passed related to the fisheries was the Bengal Private Fisheries Act, which was passed in 1889. This Fisheries Act actually allowed the zamindars to control the private ponds and the tanks in which the fish were cultured for private use. And what happened after this act, that there was no free inland fisheries in which the public could have access without license. And this act was kind of an outcome of, we can say, as the increased governmental interference in the affairs of the traditional the fisheries rights. Now, like many revenue related rights, the fisheries rights also got transferred from the common people to the zamindars, and then the zamindars were given right to the fisheries in the riverfronts adjoining these Dera landscapes. And they also control the fisheries in the private ponds which belonged to in their which lied in their area, or the pokers and the tanks and the lakes. So all these were all these lakes which were part of the area of a zamindar. The zamindar would say that the right of the fisheries belong to them. So by the last quarter of the 19th century, what we observe is that many of the British reports recommended that the fisheries might prove as a kind of a valuable source of revenue for the state. And it was after this that the British government then passed to these, Inland Fisheries Act. In the pre-colonial times, the tradition of free fishing in the rivers and ponds were given. There were, all these ponds, despite these being lying in the zamindari area, there were, the fishing community would catch fishes in those ponds and lakes. But then what happens is that after this act was passed, and even before that, the zamindars began leasing out, these pokers and lakes. And in most of the cases, what we see is that they had hired, they leased out to the highest bidder, and then they would hire the Mala community to catch fishes from those water bodies. So, there are actually references of this kind coming from this area of, various parts of Bihar. We have many British accounts. And one of the interesting account comes from a British officer, Francis Day, who was suggesting to include the inland fishing in the revenue mechanism. And this was in 1873. Now, Francis Day was particularly very, emphatic on the fact that many fisheries were available free in the nature, and we should, the British government should include those water bodies to, collect revenue from those areas. So, what Francis Day was suggesting is that, non-regulating the fisheries could have a disastrous effect. And if we regulate under, if we introduce some acts like we have in Europe, the inland fisheries could be managed very well as we are managing in Europe. So on this recommendation of Francis Day, the fisheries bill was prepared, and that also included the private rights and the prevention the rights of the on the water bodies, fish. So Indian freshwater fishes were also identified for protection. And it was argued that, because of the natural tendency of the freshwater fishes to, the fishes to migrate, there, no kind of a riparian proprietor could claim exclusive right in such passing property. So, it was believed that, it is essential for now the state that they should include all these water bodies and bring these, water bodies having fishes under some kind of an act and governance. And there is a very interesting work by Peter Reeves, who has argued that there were kind of a far-reaching changes, shifting the control from the fisheries, which seriously compromise the real conservation and needs of the fishes. Now, was the European model that they introduced, was it viable in this kind of a water-rich state of Bihar? What we see is that during the colonial period, the officials transformed the various water bodies, and the scope for fishing narrowed particularly after the ADR, what we call as the Alluvium Diluvium Regulation 1825. And by 19th century, middle of the 19th century, colonial authorities realized that, that the fish production from seasonal water bodies and ponds could be, used for generating tax. So what we see is that landlords began to recognize the economic benefits of the fish production, and leading, which actually led to conflicts between fishermen and landlords over, the various fishing rights. Now, these conflicts prompted the government to enact Fisheries Act, and then because there were conflicts about it, and it was then clearly notified that the take, that taking fish from a river or even enclosed piece of water would be kind of an offense for the people. So then this Bengal Private Protection Act, Fisheries Act, was started in 1889. Now this brings me to this whole question of the transformation that we see in the British period, and I would end with that what happens after, when the colonial government was there till 1947, the Inland Fisheries Act remained in practice. Now, even after independence, 1947, what we see is that, the Inland Fisheries Act has been, the basis of, using the water bodies for fishing, and they were leased out. So these were being leased out. But what we see in the case of a very interesting, what we have an interesting case from East Champaran, where this model has been introduced, what we call as the common base management model. This was introduced with a 2006 Regulation Act, which actually what it did was that, it introduced kind of a, it was being the water bodies, most of the months they were leased out, but then they were leased out exclusively to the Mallas. Now, this East Champaran has the highest number of water bodies. It has both perennial and seasonal ones. And, two districts, Motihari and, Turkolia district, they have the highest water bodies. You can see, look at this table here. These are coming from Central Indian Inland Fisheries Research Institute. And, this is a map which talks about the various water bodies in East Champaran, which is known as MAN. And this is East Champaran in the middle. All these oxbow lakes, they are huge lakes. Now, one of the lakes is the Mazaria Lake, which is oxbow. You have the Kararia Lake, Kararia Mon. Then, many fisher communities are actually living on this. This is the base of livelihood. And it has actually been an important source of income for them. Now, it all changed. Before 2006, there was not much of income for the fisher community. It all changed after this 2006 Bihar Fish Jalkar Management Act was passed, and these local fisher communities were given, all these water bodies were given exclusively to the fisher communities. Now, one of the interesting success story comes from Kothia Man, which is again an oxbow shape, which is a huge lake, and you have almost 200 fisher families earning their livelihood for carrying out fishes. Now, what we see is that in just, few years from 2006 onwards to 2013, the production of fishes started increasing in this area. And this is a figure coming from the state, because then, which is coming from the Department of Fisheries, Government of India, in 2013, there were 400 tons, roughly 400 tons of fish production uh, from Bihar, and it has increased to 846 ton in 2023. And it has started, the fishes from fish production has started. Of course, it is, the support has come from, various research institutes, like the important research institute being the Fisheries Inland Research Institute at Calcutta. And all these has, the scientific inputs are being given by them. But it is also actually because of the common base management model, uh, and this is the real reason behind the improved livelihood of the once vulnerable uh, fisher community. So this model, what we call as the CBFM, the common base management model, is actually it best fits such kind of riverine regions, and it advocates for kind of a uh, community led uh, ownership, community led generation of fishing. And this is this can be implemented in various other parts of such parts of landscape which had huge water bodies all around. And this is one of the success stories that is coming from East Champaran. So I will end with this, and then Pratik, can we have questions and from the audience? I think I'm right on time. Thank you for reminding me.
Thank you very much, Vipul. I mean, one thing that is evident from your talk is the need to use history as a tool and an approach, to study vulnerability and viability. And maybe we should take a little bit of time to discuss that in detail. But thank you for bringing that perspective to our ongoing work on B2B, but also the rich case study from Bihar, starting in the British era to until the new act in 2006, and and some of the impacts that are resulting from those interventions, policy interventions. So I would start with some questions that we have it here. A question from Mundus Maris. And the question is, what are the differences in fishing technologies in permanent and daira water bodies? Institutional arrangements in combination with technology tend to strongly influence sustainability related changes. So are there differences in fishing technologies in the permanent land, permanent and the daira water bodies?
So yeah, I are you asking, about the modern day technology, or you are asking about the traditional technology?
Even the traditional technology, I think, because, the daira land is, something that comes and goes, so, and it has a temporal dimension related to the water flow and all. So the question is, are there different fishing techniques or technologies when you're,
So
doing
of course,
fishing that and then the
it's a
water
good
body?
question actually. So there are land, when there are land, as you know, is a temporary land, and then the water bodies that we find is at various places. Sometimes not exactly in the main river water, where the water is so deep. Uh, Deara land itself has some water bodies, which is, and where you don't have much of the depth in the river, those water bodies. So what happens is that the common technique that they apply are very traditional ones. So they would sometimes put a net, and then they will try to catch the fishes, because it is kind of a stable water. in their landscape, when you have those water bodies, these are stable water. They are not flowing water. So what they do is that they put a net and then take out net from a particular area so that, they can take out fish. So it is different from the main river bodies, not like the main river bodies where you have the flowing water. A very important um, part of the fish production, because you have these oxbow lakes, huge oxbow lakes, which are actually linked with many rivers. So when the flood comes in those rivers, these lakes are flooded, and then the water remains throughout the year. So these lakes are full of water throughout the year, and then the fishing technology is completely different here. In fact, there has been input from the research institutes about the kind of fishes that can be grown there. But all this started, very late after, in modern times, in the 20th century, when, because the Mallas they are also given loans. I mean, they are given grants for these introduction of the new technologies.
Yeah. Thank you. I think, one aspect of that technology or fishing technique could relate to, the use of more stationary gear and mobile gear. So when there is, all season water, deep water, so there is a possibility of, mobile gear, being used. But with shallow water, typically fishers go for, fixed gear, so like trammel nets and other kinds of fixed gear. And I think in terms of technology, one thing that I was going to ask, and I will just ask it here because the question is very relevant to my question as well, is in the modern times, the use of aquaculture as a technique has increased, so maybe, you as an expert from that area could reflect on, how big is aquaculture? And of course, the production figures that you are giving, like it doubled, in 10 years from 2013 to 2023. How big is aquaculture as a technique? Uh, uh, Influences these production figures and the fishing types of fishing that goes on both in the permanent oxbow lakes, deep water, and then also there are temporary fishing areas.
I have not been able to figure out that, but I know that there has been lot of aquaculture going on in those areas, and particularly in East Champaran, and in fact also in one of the adjacent district of Madhubani and Darbhanga. I mean, these are the areas where you lot of aquaculture going on in these water bodies.
Mhm.
So, but then I'm not sure about the figures. That is an important question. We should look into it. But then that what is the contribution of the aquaculture in this production? I mean, the amount of fish that is produced through the aquaculture.
Mhm.
So this could be an interesting aspect to study.
Mhm.
Um, we shall
Yeah.
look into it.
Yeah. There is a follow-up question on the technology one, which is do they use similar technology today compared to what the British tried to regulate in the 19th century? What has been the shift is at all, if at all, in the types and use of technology in fishing in those areas?
So the British never, they were not introducing any technology. I mean, they are not bringing any technology from Europe,
Yeah.
and because they later on realize that this is a completely different waterscape. It's a riverscape which is different from what they find in Europe. So initially, they thought that the nature of these water bodies could be similar to what they find in Europe. So as I gave the example of salmon, they thought that many of the fishes would travel from one water body to the other, and so it should be regulated. But then they realized that this is a completely different waterscape, and this is something where those new technologies, I mean technologies which are applicable in Europe, could not be used here. And so we don't get any evidence. I mean, if we read the historical account, we don't get much of an evidence of any technological intervention being done by the Europeans in term, because these were all leased out. See, the British were not much concerned about the the enhancement of production further. They were just thinking that fisheries is just one of the sources of revenue, because the larger portion of revenue was coming from various other sources. So they were just thinking that they are just leasing it out. They are giving it to the highest bidder, and how they take out the fish, enhance the revenue through that, it's their problem.
Yeah, it looks like there was a complete disconnect, and you emphasized that in your talk that the model was revenue collection. So the emphasis was on revenue, and the emphasis was not on technology or facilitating, fish
The
production
fishes.
itself. Um, and I believe that the revenue, amount of revenue was not determined by the amount of fish. It was kind of, fixed to the land or the area itself. Yeah, and that's a really crucial piece in terms of how revenue systems work, how policies work. They may be targeting one particular aspect of the fishery and blatantly, ignoring other important aspects of the fishery. For example, the disconnect between amount of revenue and the amount of fish, and the types of technology and other kinds of things. I know we're getting to the end of the time here, but I have a quick question to ask you so that you can provide some helpful guidance, given your expertise in the history subject area. You know, um, One thing that is coming across from your talk is the importance of history as a methodological approach to study vulnerability to viability transitions. So we use multiple, different approaches and from different disciplinary, domains. So what does it mean to, use history in how we understand, study, and analyze the V2V transitions, as an approach? So, are there any key reflections that you would like to bring?
When it comes to studying such historical time periods, it's normally it's a trend in history that historians say that when they study about a problem, they try to figure out the reason behind those problems, and their task ends there. Now this is a completely new way of studying history, that history has to be connected to the modern day problems, and whether history can be used as a model for the solution for the future, this is something which is very debatable among historians themselves. I mean, these historians actually are very critical about it. They say that history, the task of historian ends there. But in what I have seen in many cases, and during my uh, research and interaction with many historians, environmental historians in particular, uh, who are doing interdisciplinary works, I mean, they are of the opinion, and I know many of my colleagues from Japan and United States and Germany, they think that we have this ability. I mean, we have the potential to develop models, and through our historical case studies. Now, like this is one of the best examples to give you that
Hmm.
here you have a you have a community which is actually vulnerable, traditionally vulnerable. Now, when it comes to, to make their life as more sustainable and more, improve their livelihood, we have, I don't know whether the government has followed any historical account to introduce that, but then, that gives actually kind of a thrust to that kind of a model that the present day government is following. When they introduced 2006 Act and started leasing out those water bodies to the mullahs and the fishers, they might not have gone into the details of what has happened in history, but I'm very sure that when we give inputs as historian, when we give input, that this has been a problem in the past, this would give more support to the governments to continue with authenticity. So history actually gives you a kind of a kind of an input of, in some sense, that what is the problem with an alternative model and what is the problem with a model which is successful. I mean, what are the benefits of the successful model?
Yeah.
So in that sense, I mean, it is not only in the case of the fishers. I mean, even in the case of the kind of pollution that we find all around the globe, and we have already been talking about various kind of pollution. I mean, we have cases from United States, we had cases from USSR when there were dust storms all around in the 1930s, and then, in middle of the 20th century. Now here, I mean, you will find, why these dust storms came. These were the models that these dust storms came because of the exploitation of the soil, intense exploitation of the soil, which is a soil which is not actually, does not have the capacity to hold this kind of a intense cultivation. So, I mean, these problems from the past actually give you inputs and develop models for the future. That these are the things that you should not do. Right? So
Yeah.
I think history has a role to play even in modern day policy making, and historians should not shy away from giving inputs and developing models for future.
Yeah. I mean,
I think over the years, what we will see that even historians will get into it. I mean, this is just a beginning, but that makes history much more interesting and useful.
yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, that's a really, really wonderful way to conclude, because you're saying history, the days are gone when history used to just do retrospective, analysis, so looking into the past. So in addition to looking into the past, it is more future looking now. So we know there are new areas that are coming. Environmental history is one of the areas which is, more interdisciplinary. There is more problem focused in terms of historical approach, history and policy, history for solutions that I know you already mentioned, and how you can develop models based on historical accounts. And there is a particular area of research where people build scenarios, and historical analysis can provide some really critical pathways for engaging in building those scenarios, not for only policy and governance, but also for you know day-to-day engagement of fishers in the fishing activities, upholding their rights and access and all of those kind of things. So there are many lessons to take from an historical approach to study vulnerability and viability. We'll continue this discussion, people. This is wonderful. Thank you very much for the time today. I have to unfortunately bring this to an end because we are past time. And also thank you to all the audiences for the wonderful questions and your patience in in attending this. So thank you once again, everyone.
Thank you.